I placed the silver digital voice recorder perfectly parallel to the edge of the mahogany table. Click. The small red light blinked to life, a steady, rhythmic pulse. It was exactly 9:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. The climate control in conference room A was set to a crisp 68 degrees, but Sarah, my CEO, was sweating. We were 54 floors above the Manhattan streets. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of a city preparing for an autumn storm, heavy gray clouds pressing down on the skyline. It was a view that cost millions, a fitting backdrop for an acquisition deal worth hundreds of millions more. Across the expanse of polished wood sat the executive team from Vance conglomerate. At their center was Sterling Vance. He did not look like a man about to sign away a fortune. He looked like a man deciding whether a complex machine was worth breaking apart just to see how the gears fractured. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that seemed to swallow the light in the room. His posture was perfectly relaxed, yet it carried the kind of contained stillness that reads as deeply predatory. Since walking into the building, he had not spoken a single word of English. "I am Elias Reed. I am a senior interpreter. My job is precision. French to English, English to French. I do not guess I convey. I pride myself on being an invisible, flawless bridge between two languages. I have a slight obsessive-compulsive need for accuracy, which makes me exceptional at what I do." Today, however, that bridge was about to catch fire. The room was heavy with silence. Sarah shifted her weight beside me. She needed this buyout to save the company from going under. The Vance conglomerate was notorious for its aggressive corporate takeovers, and Sterling Vance was the architect of their ruthlessness. His legal team sat flanking him like identical shadows. They all wore discreet, high-tech translation earpieces, relying on AI software to feed them the proceedings. Sterling apparently relied on me. He leaned forward slowly, resting his forearms on the table. He did not look at Sarah, the woman holding the company's fate in her hands. He looked directly at me. His eyes were a startling pale gray, pinning me to my seat with absolute focus. Then he spoke. It was French, but it was not the pristine, standardized boardroom French I had spent weeks preparing for. It was an archaic, highly localized dialect, laced with an old Parisian street slang that bordered on the literary. It was the kind of phrasing that algorithmic translation software completely chokes on. Across the table, his lawyers frowned slightly, tapping their earpieces as the AI fed them a garbled mess of literal nonsense. But I caught it. Every single syllable. "Tes you ont la couleur du ciel de Manhattan avant la tempête." I froze. My brain misfired, rebooted, and ran the syntax a second time to ensure I hadn't suffered a sudden stroke. The translation echoed in my head. "Your eyes have the color of the Manhattan sky before a storm." I waited for the rest of the sentence. A clever metaphor about market volatility, a bizarre, artistic segue into supply chain logistics. Nothing. He just sat there, staring at my eyes. It was a pickup line, a cheap, ridiculously poetic, profoundly inappropriate pickup line delivered in the middle of a $300 million negotiation. Sarah leaned toward me, her pen hovering over her notepad. The entire room waited. The silence stretched, turning brittle. My heart rate spiked, hammering against my ribs, but my face remained an unreadable mask. If I translated his words literally, the negotiation would derail instantly. Sarah would think he was mocking us, or worse, entirely unhinged. The board would panic. The deal would collapse, and I would be the casualty caught in the crossfire. Furthermore, his own team, who didn't understand the archaic phrasing, was waiting for my English output to contextualize their CEO's tone. I had 3 seconds to make a choice: ruin the deal or lie. I chose the lie. I adjusted my posture, ensuring my shoulders were squared. I channeled my most authoritative, professional, deadpan voice. "Mr. Vance warns," I said, looking right back into those icy gray eyes, "that our supply chain is currently facing a storm of risks. A storm that has the potential to sink all of our current operational efforts." Complete silence. Sarah paled visibly. He thinks our supply chain is that vulnerable," she whispered to me, her voice tight with panic. "Yes," I lied smoothly, staring blankly ahead. "He is very concerned about the turbulence." I braced myself. I expected Sterling to frown. I expected him to slam a hand on the table and correct me in flawless English. I expected to be fired on the spot and escorted out of the building by security. He didn't correct me. Instead, the absolute faintest ghost of a smirk touched the corner of his mouth. It was barely there, a micro-expression of pure amusement that vanished before anyone else could register it. He leaned back in his leather chair, seemingly delighted by my sheer, desperate audacity. He steepled his fingers and spoke again. Same archaic French, same heavy, unblinking gaze fixed entirely on me. His meaning was clear: if you are a liar, little bird, let us see how well you fly. My stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. Across the table, the earpieces of his legal team blinked uselessly. Sarah nudged my arm. Elias. What did he say now? I swallowed the dry lump in my throat. I stared at the silver recorder on the table, watching the red light blink, knowing it was capturing every agonizing second of my professional suicide. Mr. Vance says, I replied, my voice remarkably steady despite the chaos in my head, that if we want this deal to proceed, we need to immediately prove the agility of our current infrastructure. Sterling Vance nodded slowly, acknowledging my translation with a slight tilt of his head. He was playing a game, a dangerous, inexplicable game, and I had just voluntarily dealt myself in. By Thursday afternoon, my translations had cost the company $40 million in projected equity. The negotiations had settled into a grueling, relentless rhythm. We spent 12 hours a day in conference room A. The silver digital voice recorder remained in its exact position on the mahogany table, its blinking red light serving as a constant, mocking reminder of my compounding perjury. Sterling Vance did not stop. If anything, my initial lie had only encouraged him. He had found a crack in the pristine glass of my professionalism, and he was methodically tapping on it with a hammer. He continued to use that obscure, archaic French. His own legal team, a row of impeccably dressed European sharks, grew increasingly frustrated. Their earpieces were failing them. The software could not parse Sterling's localized slang, leaving them reliant entirely on my English renditions to understand their own CEO strategy. And my renditions were spectacularly brutal. At 11:00 a.m., Sterling leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of sparkling water. He locked eyes with me. The rest of the room faded into secondary noise. Topo LRC Freud su CES neons. Jimmy demand C tu bruler eyes CGT touch eyes. He murmured. I translated the words in my mind. Your skin looks so cold under these fluorescents. I wonder if you would burn if I touched you. My pulse stuttered. The sheer audacity of it made my lungs tight. Across the table, his lead counsel, a man named Francois, tapped his earpiece in annoyance and looked at me expectantly. Beside me, Sarah gripped her pen so hard her knuckles were white. I did not blink. I kept my voice completely devoid of inflection. Mr. Vance notes, I said smoothly, that our current liquidity is too frozen under these market conditions. He wonders if our operational framework would collapse under immediate financial pressure. Francois nodded sharply, taking rapid notes on his tablet. He seemed deeply impressed by his boss's ruthless financial metaphor. Sarah swallowed hard. Tell him our liquidity is secure. We have buffers. I translated her defense into standard, flawless French. Sterling listened, his eyes never leaving mine, that phantom smirk playing at the corners of his mouth again. He was enjoying this. He was watching me construct a terrifying corporate mastermind out of thin air, using his absurd romantic overtures as the raw material. I was trapped. I could not suddenly start translating his actual words. Doing so would expose my previous fabrications, ruin the deal, and destroy my career. I had to maintain the illusion. I had to keep translating his poetry into poison. By 3:00 p.m., he dropped another one. Je vous tiens from dans une case de verre. Just pour moi, he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated across the polished wood. The meaning was unmistakable. I want to lock you in a glass cage. Just for me. My stomach twisted. I adjusted my tie. Mr. Vance demands absolute exclusivity, I announced to the room. He wants an ironclad freeze on our secondary market options. We are to entertain no other buyers. A complete lock-in. The room erupted into hushed, frantic whispers. The Vance team looked momentarily surprised by the severity of the demand, but Francois quickly masked it, adopting a hardline posture to match my translation. Sarah called for a recess. She pulled me out into the hallway, dragging me toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray expanse of Manhattan. Her hands were shaking. He's a monster, she breathed, staring out at the skyline. Elias, the man is an absolute apex predator. He isn't just trying to buy us. He's trying to strip us to the bone. Guilt, cold and sharp, pierced my chest. Sarah, perhaps we should slow down. We can push back. No, she interrupted, her eyes wide and panicked. You heard him. He knows our liquidity is tight. He wants a lock-in. If we don't show him we have leverage, he will force a hostile takeover at half the valuation. She pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. "I am calling an emergency board meeting tonight," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am going to propose we leverage the building." I froze. The blood drained from my face. "The building, sir. You can't mortgage the Manhattan headquarters. That's corporate suicide if the deal falls through. It's the only way to generate the capital buffer to call his bluff," she insisted, entirely convinced. "Your translations, Elias. They've been a godsend. You are reading the subtext perfectly. If you hadn't caught the sheer aggression in his phrasing, we would be walking into a slaughterhouse blindly. You are saving this company." She squeezed my shoulder gratefully and walked away to make the call. I stood alone in the hallway. The climate controls suddenly felt suffocating. I was not saving the company. I was sinking it, based entirely on my fictionalized translations of a billionaire's bizarre flirtations. My CEO was about to leverage a 50-story skyscraper in the middle of Manhattan. Tens of millions of dollars, the jobs of 500 employees, the legacy of the firm, all balancing on a lie I told because I was too proud to admit I was being hit on in a boardroom. I felt nauseous. The analytical drive that made me so good at my job was now running catastrophic risk assessments in my head. I turned around. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I saw Sterling Vance. He was still sitting at the table. His team was busy organizing files, but he was doing nothing. He was simply looking through the glass, directly at me. Our eyes met. He tilted his head, just a fraction. He did not look like a man oblivious to the chaos he was causing. He looked like a man who knew exactly what the collateral damage was, and was waiting to see how long I could carry the weight before I snapped. I walked back into the room. I took my seat. I pressed my thumb against the edge of the silver recorder, feeling the cold metal. I could not confess, but I could not let Sarah lose the building. I had to find a way to break him before he broke me. It was 2:14 a.m. The glow of my dual monitors cast long, sharp shadows across my living room. I had not slept. I had not even loosened my tie. On the screen, the audio waveform from the silver digital recorder pulsed in jagged green lines. I was running the 12 hours of conference room A through a spectral analysis program, usually. I use this software to clean up muffled syllables or isolate overlapping dialogue in chaotic meetings. Tonight, I was hunting. Logic is a physical thing to me. When a system is broken, you do not panic, you disassemble it until you find the faulty gear. Sterling Vance was a faulty gear. His behavior defied every established metric of high-stakes corporate negotiation. You do not risk a $300 million acquisition to sexually harass an interpreter. It was inefficient. It was irrational. And men who build empires like the Vance conglomerate are never irrational. I rubbed my eyes, taking a sip of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. I clicked the mouse, isolating Sterling's vocal frequency. My plan was simple. I wanted to find a linguistic flaw. I wanted to analyze his archaic French, find a regional inconsistency, a grammatical slip, anything I could use to quietly corner him and force a ceasefire. I needed leverage to save Sarah's building. I put on my noise-canceling headphones. I closed my eyes. I hit play. Je vous tiens from dans une cage de verre. His voice, stripped of the room's ambient noise, was unnervingly intimate. It vibrated right against my eardrums, a low, dark resonance. I ignored the shiver that crawled up my spine and focused purely on the phonetics, the vowels, the consonants, the breath control. It was flawless. Too flawless. Frustrated, I expanded the audio spectrum, stripping away his voice to listen to the room's background noise. The hum of the HVAC system, the scratching of Sarah's pen, the shifting of leather chairs. Then I heard it buzz buzz. I paused the track. My eyes snapped open. I reversed the audio by 5 seconds. I boosted the low-frequency gain. Buzz buzz. It was the distinct, rhythmic vibration of a smartphone on silent mode, pressed hard against the underside of a solid wood table. It was incredibly faint, masked entirely by the ambient noise of the room, but the software caught it. I checked the timestamp, 3:04 p.m. My breath caught. 3:04 p.m. was the exact moment I had delivered the fake translation about Sterling demanding an ironclad freeze on our secondary market options. I began scrubbing through the timeline, my heart beating a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. 11:02 a.m. buzz, buzz. 2 seconds after I translated the fake threat about our liquidity collapsing. 9:15 a.m. buzz, buzz. right after Sarah had inadvertently revealed our quarterly profit margins during her opening statement. Someone was transmitting live data. I pulled up the security still from the conference room camera, a standard procedure file I had requested from IT earlier, under the guise of evaluating acoustic positioning. I zoomed in on the Vance conglomerate's side of the table. Sterling sat in the center, his hands resting visibly on the polished mahogany. To his left, 2 junior analysts. To his right, Francois, the lead counsel. Francois, who always kept his left hand beneath the table. Francois, who took rapid notes on his tablet with his right hand every time a major financial data point was dropped. A cold, clarifying wave of realization washed over me. Francois was leaking the negotiation in real time. But to whom? Why would the lead counsel sabotage his own CEO's acquisition? The answer was simple: corporate warfare. The Vance board of directors back in Europe. Sterling had built the company's ruthless reputation, but perhaps he had grown too powerful. An internal coup. If this deal fell through catastrophically, or if the board could use insider information to short the stock before an intentional collapse, Sterling would be ousted. I leaned back in my chair, the silence of my apartment suddenly deafening. The puzzle pieces were rearranging themselves, forming a terrifying new picture. Francois was a mole. He was relying on the AI earpiece to understand Sterling. And Sterling was a predator. Predators do not have blind spots in their own territory. Did he know? I looked at the silver recorder sitting beside my keyboard. If Sterling knew about the mole, he couldn't speak freely. He couldn't discuss actual strategy because Francois was broadcasting every word. The AI translation software was Francois's only way of understanding the room. I realized the truth: the AI software could not parse Sterling's localized, archaic slang. My blood ran ice cold. Sterling wasn't flirting with me. He wasn't playing a sadistic game to break my professionalism. He was bypassing the software. He was intentionally speaking in a dialect his own team couldn't understand, knowing that I, the obsessively accurate human interpreter, was the only one who could. He was using my translations, my fake, brutal, ruthless translations. He had thrown me an absurd pickup line, watched me spin it into a corporate threat, and realized I had the exact analytical mind he needed to negotiate the deal for him, right under the nose of his traitorous counsel. I wasn't a victim of harassment. I was a proxy weapon. I stared at the green waveform on the screen, the sheer, staggering arrogance of the man. He had hijacked my career, weaponized my pride, and nearly pushed Sarah into bankrupting the company, all to wage a shadow war against his own board. My hand stopped shaking. The panic that had been suffocating me for 2 days evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, absolute fury. Tomorrow night was the closing gala dinner, the final social event before the contracts were drawn up on Friday. I stood up, untying my necktie and tossing it onto the desk. I walked over to my closet and looked at the black suit I had prepared for tomorrow. Sterling Vance thought he could use me as a blind pawn on his chessboard. He thought he could manipulate my translations to serve his agenda while leaving me to carry the psychological weight of the lie. He had underestimated me. I am an interpreter. I control the flow of information. If he wanted to play a game of shadows in the middle of Manhattan, I was going to rewrite the rules. The crystal chandeliers in the grand ballroom of the Pier Hotel cost more than my entire life's earnings. They fractured the light into a million blinding, glittering shards, raining down on the corporate elite of 2 continents. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated with trays of vintage champagne. A string quartet played Bach in the corner. It was a masterpiece of corporate theater, and I was standing right in the middle of the stage. I wore the black suit. My posture was impeccable. My expression was a carefully calibrated mask of polite, professional disinterest. Beside me, Sarah was holding court with a group of Vance conglomerate executives, her confidence buoyed by the aggressive strategy she believed we were executing. She looked radiant, entirely unaware that the foundation of her confidence was built on my fabricated translations. Across the room, standing near an ice sculpture that was slowly weeping onto a silver platter, was Sterling Vance. He was surrounded by investors, yet he looked completely isolated. It was that same contained, predatory stillness. Even in a tuxedo, holding a crystal flute, he looked like a man calculating the structural weaknesses of the building. Francois stood 2 paces behind him, dutifully nursing a scotch, his left hand resting casually in his pocket. The mole in the mastermind. I took a sip of my champagne. It tasted like ash. The air in the ballroom was growing too thin, the perfume, the expensive cologne, The heavy hum of overlapping conversations, it was suffocating. My tie felt like a garrote. I set my glass on a passing tray and slipped away from Sarah's group, navigating the labyrinth of silk and velvet until I found a set of heavy glass doors leading out to the terrace. I pushed them open and stepped into the New York night. The air was sharp, carrying the bite of the impending storm and the electric tang of the city. The terrace wrapped around the side of the hotel, casting deep shadows away from the ballroom's glare. Below, the grid of Manhattan pulsed with golden light. I walked to the edge of the stone balustrade, gripping the cold marble. I closed my eyes and focused on the rhythmic sound of traffic 50 floors down. I needed to center myself. Tomorrow was the final negotiation. I had the audio proof of Francois's betrayal, but I still needed a strategy to dismantle Sterling's game without destroying Sarah in the process. No, let him keep digging. The voice came from the darkness to my left. I froze, every muscle in my body locked. It was a man's voice, low, authoritative, and utterly devoid of hesitation. But it wasn't just the tone that paralyzed me. It was the accent. It was flawless, unaccented, brutally crisp American English. It sounded like old money and East Coast boarding schools. It possessed not a single trace of European inflection. I don't care what the board thinks they know, the voice continued, the tone sharpening into cold steel. Francois is transmitting to them exactly what I want them to hear. They think I'm derailing the acquisition. By the time they realize I'm restructuring the debt to dilute their voting shares, the ink will be dry. I pressed my back against a stone pillar, holding my breath. I didn't need to see his face, the cadence. The low resonance, it was the same voice that had spent the last 3 days purring archaic French poetry at me across a mahogany table. Sterling Vance. The interpreter, Sterling let out a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh. He's brilliant. Unintentionally, but brilliant. I throw him a line of Parisian street trash, and he spins it into the most aggressive corporate threats I've ever heard. He's absolutely terrified of losing face. He's carrying the entire narrative, and Francois is feeding it straight to the board. My chest tightened so painfully I thought my ribs might crack. Unintentionally brilliant, he had called me. Terrified of losing face. A pause. Sterling was listening to the person on the other end of the line. No, leave the interpreter out of the fallout, Sterling commanded, his voice dropping a fraction. He's a civilian. When I purge Francois in the board tomorrow, the kid walks away clean. He served his purpose. He served his purpose. I closed my eyes. The humiliation was sudden and violently sharp. It wasn't just that he had lied. It was the clinical, detached way he evaluated me. I wasn't an adversary. I wasn't even a player. I was a tool. A conveniently obsessive, highly articulate tool that he had picked up, used to bludgeon his own board of directors, and now planned to discard. The phone call ended with a soft beep. I heard the rustle of fabric as Sterling put the phone in his pocket. He stepped out from the shadows of the alcove, moving toward the ballroom doors. To do so, he had to walk past my pillar. I could have stayed hidden. I could have held my breath and let him pass, taking this new, explosive information back to my apartment to plot my revenge in safety. But logic is a physical thing to me. And right now, my logic was demanding a rebalance of power. I stepped out of the shadow. Sterling stopped dead. For the first time since he walked into my conference room, the mask slipped. His pale gray eyes widened by a fraction of a millimeter. The absolute, unshakable stillness of the Billionaire CEO fractured for one split second. He knew I had heard. We stood there on the terrace, bathed in the dim light of the city below, surrounded by the deafening silence of the impending storm. I did not yell. I did not demand an explanation. I did not even look angry. I simply looked at him with the exact same cold, analytical dissection he had applied to me. "Your English," I said, my voice barely a whisper, perfectly steady and utterly devoid of emotion, "is adequate." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I turned my back on him, opened the glass doors, and walked back into the blinding light of his corporate theater. I wasn't a civilian anymore. And tomorrow, I was going to burn his stage to the ground. The Pier Hotel felt like a distant, glittering hallucination by the time my taxi pulled up to the corporate headquarters. It was 1:15 a.m. The lobby was cavernous and silent, manned only by a single security guard who barely glanced up from his monitor as I swiped my badge. The elevator ride to the 54th floor was smooth, silent, and relentlessly fast. My ears popped. The sensation grounded me, a physical reminder of the altitude I was about to fall from. The motion sensor lights flickered to life as I stepped off the elevator, carving a sterile, fluorescent path through the darkness. The floor was entirely empty. The manic energy of the day, the frantic whispers of Sarah's team, the heavy tension of the Vance conglomerate executives, it was all scrubbed away, leaving only the hum of the climate control system. I walked to my desk. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I sat in the dim, localized glow of my desk lamp. I took off my suit jacket and draped it perfectly over the back of my ergonomic chair. I loosened my tie, pulling the silk free, and unbuttoned my collar. For a long time, I simply sat there, staring at the panoramic window. The storm Sterling had promised on the first day was finally arriving. I could see the lightning pulsing deep within the heavy clouds over the Hudson River, thick and ominous, waiting to break. He's a civilian. When I purge Francois in the board tomorrow, the kid walks away clean. He served his purpose. The words echoed in the quiet space. Sterling Vance had calculated my pride. He had mapped my obsessive need for perfection, and he had used it to build a firewall against his own board of directors. He had assumed I would simply translate his poison, carry the psychological weight of the deception, collect my paycheck, and vanish when the dust settled. A tool, a highly functional, exceptionally articulate tool. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled out a flat, unassembled cardboard box. Tools do not have agency. Tools do not have pride. But Sterling Vance did not understand what happens when a civilian decides to pick up the bomb and walk it directly back into the general's tent. I folded the flaps of the cardboard box, pressing the packing tape down with a sharp, definitive tear. I started with my reference books, the Oxford French-English Dictionary, and advanced corporate terminology. I placed them flat at the bottom, aligning the spines perfectly with the corners of the box. Next went my customized mechanical keyboard, its cable wrapped in neat, concentric circles, then my collection of fountain pens, secured in their leather case. Every item I placed in the box was a physical severing of a tie. I had spent 6 years building my reputation at this firm. I had worked 80-hour weeks. I had sacrificed holidays and relationships to become the invisible, flawless bridge between languages, and now, I was dismantling it all in the middle of the night. It terrified me. My heart maintained a low, frantic thrumming against my ribs. The logical, self-preserving part of my brain screamed at me to stop, to let Sterling execute his purge tomorrow, to keep my head down and survive. But logic is a double-edged sword. And my logic dictated that if I stayed, if I allowed Sarah to sign that leveraged mortgage tomorrow based on my lies, I would be complicit. I would be nothing more than Sterling's accomplice. I picked up a framed photograph of myself and my sister at her graduation. I wrapped it carefully in a spare sweater and laid it gently in the box. I did not want to look at anything that anchored me to a future in this building. When you go to war with a billionaire, you cannot afford to have hostages. At 3:00 a.m., the rain finally hit the glass. It sounded like gravel being thrown against the windows. I turned on my computer. The screen cast a pale blue light across my face. I opened a blank document. I typed the resignation letter with measured, deliberate keystrokes. There was no emotion in the text. No dramatic explanations or bitter accusations. It was 2 paragraphs of pure, administrative finality. It read, effective immediately upon the conclusion of the Vance conglomerate acquisition proceedings on Friday, November 12. I hit print. The laser printer in the corner whirred to life, spitting out the single sheet of heavy stock paper. I signed it with a black pen. I placed it in a crisp white envelope, wrote Sarah's name on the front, and set it perfectly parallel to the edge of my desk pad. I looked around the cubicle. It was stripped bare. It looked like I had never existed here at all. There was only one item left on the desk. I picked up the silver digital voice recorder. I wiped it clean with a microfiber cloth, removing any fingerprints. I checked the battery level. 98%. More than enough. I slipped it into the breast pocket of my suit jacket. It was 5:30 a.m. The sky outside was turning a bruised, violent shade of purple. The storm was raging, the wind howling against the reinforced glass of the 54th floor. I walked to the executive washroom. I splashed freezing cold water on my face. I dried my skin, retied my silk tie with exact, mathematical precision, and put my suit jacket back on. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were slightly hollow from lack of sleep, but my posture was ironclad. Sterling Vance wanted to use me to deliver his final blow. I was going to give him exactly what he wanted, a flawless, uncompromising translation. I walked out of the washroom and headed toward conference room A. I was the first one there. I sat in my chair, placed the silver recorder on the table, and waited for the players to arrive. At 8:55 a.m., conference room A was a pressure cooker. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Manhattan storm had fully broken. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass in violent, erratic sheets, turning the morning sky the color of bruised iron. Inside, the climate control hummed, desperately trying to neutralize the suffocating tension. Sarah sat beside me. She looked completely exhausted. In front of her sat a leather-bound folder containing the leveraged mortgage agreements for the building. She was prepared to bet the entire legacy of the company on the corporate ghost I had manufactured. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the heavy oak doors opened. Sterling Vance walked in. He wore a navy suit today, sharp and immaculate. Francois shadowed him, tablet already in hand, his left hand instinctively sliding into his pocket. The mole was ready to broadcast the final kill shot to the board in Europe. Sterling took his seat at the center of the table. He did not look at the contracts. He did not look at Sarah. He looked at me. There was a subtle anticipation in his pale gray eyes. He was waiting for his proxy weapon to fire. He was waiting for me to take whatever absurdity he was about to say and forge it into the final, terrifying demand that would force Sarah to sign. He rested his forearms on the mahogany table. The room fell dead silent. Tu es la chose la plus fascinante que j'ai jamais vue, Sterling murmured, his voice a dark, velvet thrum that cut effortlessly through the quiet. Je vais te mettre dans une cage de verre dans mon bureau, et je jetterai la clé. The translation rang in my head. You are the most fascinating thing I have ever seen. I am going to put you in a glass cage in my office, and I will throw away the key. It was the same motif. The glass cage. The possessiveness. Francois tapped his earpiece, frowning slightly as the AI failed him once again. He looked at me, his pen poised over his screen, waiting for the translation. Sarah leaned in, her face pale, bracing for the impact of the final financial blow. Sterling watched my mouth, waiting for the lie. I did not lie. I reached forward. My fingers closed around the silver digital voice recorder. I did not pick it up. Instead, I pressed my index finger against the edge and pushed it slowly, deliberately, into the exact center of the table. The scrape of the metal base against the polished mahogany was loud. It sounded like the unsheathing of a blade. The red recording light blinked steadily. I kept my hand resting near the device. I looked at Sarah. I looked at Francois. Finally, I locked eyes with Sterling Vance. My face was a mask of pure, unadulterated ice. Mr. Vance states, I said, my voice projecting with perfect, boardroom clarity, that I am the most fascinating thing he has ever seen. Sarah blinked. Her pen slipped, leaving a stray mark on the legal pad. Furthermore, I continued, my tone completely deadpan, refusing to break eye contact with Sterling. Mr. Vance informs the room that he intends to put me in a glass cage in his personal office, and that he will throw away the key. Absolute, paralyzing silence descended upon conference room A. It was the kind of silence that occurs right after a car crash, before the shock wears off and the screaming begins. Elias, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with profound confusion. What? What did you just say? Across the table, the Vance conglomerate executives looked utterly bewildered. They didn't speak French, but they understood the English I had just delivered, and it made absolutely no sense in the context of a $300 million acquisition. Francois stared at me, his mouth slightly open. His left hand twitched in his pocket. He was panicking. This was not a corporate threat. This was not actionable intelligence he could transmit to the board. I ignored them all. I watched Sterling. For 3 agonizing seconds, the billionaire CEO did not move. He stared at the silver recorder sitting in the center of the table, then slowly. His eyes dragged up to meet mine. The mask was gone. He wasn't looking at a tool anymore. He was looking at an equal. To my absolute shock, a genuine, helpless smile broke across his face. It wasn't the phantom smirk I had seen before. It was a real smile, sharp and brilliant, transforming his terrifying features into something entirely different. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. Well, Sterling Vance said. His voice was no longer low, European murmur. It was crisp. It was authoritative. It was flawless, unaccented, East Coast American English. That certainly accelerates the timeline. Sarah gasped audibly. Francois dropped his stylus. It clattered loudly against the wood. You speak English, Sarah stammered, staring at Sterling as if he had just risen from the dead. Fluently, Sterling replied, his gray eyes still fixed entirely on me. Though I admit, I found Mr. Reed's interpretations vastly more entertaining than my actual legal counsel. He turned his head slowly, his gaze shifting from me to Francois. The warmth vanished from his eyes instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating brutality. Speaking of legal counsel, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm, Francois, take your left hand out of your pocket. Place the phone on the table. Francois turned the color of ash. Sir, I don't. Now, Sterling commanded. It wasn't a request. Trembling, Francois pulled a sleek black smartphone from his pocket and placed it on the mahogany. The screen was lit up, showing an active, encrypted text thread. Security is waiting for you in the lobby, Sterling said, not even looking at the phone. Your severance has been voided due to corporate espionage. The board members you are currently messaging have just been locked out of the company's mainframe. You have exactly 2 minutes to exit this building before I have you arrested for wire fraud. Francois didn't argue, he stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor, and fled the room. The remaining Vance executives sat in stunned, terrified silence. Sterling turned back to Sarah. He reached across the table, grabbed the folder containing her leveraged mortgage agreements, and calmly tossed it into the wastebasket. We won't be needing those, Sarah, he said smoothly. My initial offer stands. No hostile takeover. No lock-ins, a straight, clean acquisition, retaining all your current staff. He paused, his eyes sliding back to me. The storm raged outside, but inside, the air had cleared entirely. With one specific exception, Sterling added softly. The room emptied with a frantic, terrified efficiency. The Vance conglomerate executives gathered their briefcases and filed out, looking like men who had just survived a firing squad. Sarah was the last to stand. She looked at the wastebasket where her leveraged mortgage agreements now rested, then at Sterling, and finally at me. Elias, she said softly, still grappling with the sheer velocity of the whiplash. I'll handle this, Sarah, I said. My voice was calm. It was the absolute, unshakable calm of a man who had already packed up his life in a cardboard box on the 54th floor. She nodded, trusting me one last time, and walked out. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, the sound echoing loudly in the cavernous room. Then, there were two. The Manhattan storm continued to hurl rain against the glass, a chaotic backdrop to the sudden, profound quiet of Conference Room A. Sterling Vance sat at the head of the table. I sat a few seats down. Between us sat the silver digital voice recorder, its red light still blinking. Sterling reached forward and picked up the recorder. He didn't turn it off. He simply held it, turning the cold metal over in his hands. You know, he said. His American accent was still jarring, sharp and refined. I analyzed the audio tracks at 2 in the morning, I replied, my posture perfectly rigid. I caught the vibration of Francois' phone. Once I realized he was transmitting data, the rest of the calculus was simple. Your localized French wasn't a game. It was a bypass. Sterling let out a low, genuine laugh. It was a rich, dark sound that vibrated in the empty room. A bypass, he agreed, leaning back in his chair. My board of directors grew greedy. They wanted to sabotage this acquisition, short the stock, and vote me out. Francois was their eyes and ears. If I spoke strategy, he broadcasted it. If I used the eye translation software, he monitored it. He looked at me, his pale gray eyes alight with a sharp, intellectual hunger. So, I threw you a line of Parisian street poetry just to see what the software would do. I expected you to stumble. I expected you to formally complain. Sterling tilted his head instead. You stared me dead in the eye and fabricated the most ruthless, brilliant corporate strategy I have ever heard. You took my nonsense and built a guillotine out of it. You used me to wage a proxy war against your own company, I stated. The anger in my voice carefully distilled into ice. I weaponized you, Mr. Reed, Sterling corrected softly. There is a difference. I needed a strategist who wasn't on Francois' payroll. Someone who understood the subtext of power well enough to negotiate this deal without ever actually discussing the deal. You played the board perfectly. You gave them a terrifying narrative, forced them to panic, and gave me the window I needed to sever their access. And the collateral damage, I asked, my tone dropping to a whisper. Sarah nearly leveraged this entire building because of the lies I was forced to tell. You let me carry the psychological weight of bankrupting my own firm. Sterling's expression shifted. The amusement faded, replaced by a heavy, grounding seriousness. He placed the silver recorder back on the table, pushing it slightly toward me. I knew you wouldn't let her sign it, he said quietly. I watched you. You are entirely too meticulous, too fiercely protective of your logic. to let a system fail on your watch. I pushed you because I needed to see exactly where your breaking point was. And did you find it? No, Sterling said, his gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before meeting my eyes again. I found parity. Parity equality. I looked at this man, a billionaire apex predator who had orchestrated a multinational corporate purge without ever raising his voice. He had stripped me of my professional safety, dragged me into his war, and was now sitting across from me, offering his respect. It wasn't enough. I reached inside the breast pocket of my suit jacket. My fingers closed around the crisp, heavy stock of the white envelope. I pulled it out and placed it flat on the mahogany table. With 2 fingers, I slid the envelope across the polished wood. It stopped exactly an inch from Sterling's hand. He looked down at it. He didn't ask what it was, he knew. I am an interpreter, Mr. Vance, I said, my voice steady, devoid of any tremor. I demand precision, and I demand transparency. You treated me as a variable in an equation. I do not work for people who view me as a tool to be discarded when the objective is met. My resignation is effective immediately. Sterling stared at the white envelope. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain lashing against the glass. Then slowly, he picked it up. He broke the seal. He withdrew the single sheet of paper and read the 2 paragraphs of administrative finality I had typed at 3:00 a.m. He finished reading. He looked up at me. And then with slow, deliberate precision, Sterling Vance tore the paper in half. He placed the torn pieces back on the table. He leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us, his presence suddenly overwhelming, smelling of cedar cold air, and something dangerously electric. I don't need an interpreter, Elias, he said, using my first name for the very first time. The sound of it in his natural accent made my heart stutter. I need a strategist. I need someone who can sit across from me, see through my bullshit, and possess the sheer, terrifying audacity to rewrite the rules when the system is rigged. I didn't move. I didn't break eye contact. I am not looking for a new job. Good, Sterling murmured. Because I am not offering you one. I am offering you a partnership. Special strategic advisor to the CEO of the Vance conglomerate. You report to no one but me. You sit in on every negotiation. And if I ever cross a line, you have my full permission to push a voice recorder to the center of the table and ruin me. My breath hitched. It was a surrender wrapped in a challenge. It was a promise of power, of equality, of standing beside the fire instead of being burned by it. I looked at the torn pieces of my resignation letter. I looked at the silver recorder. Then, I looked back at Sterling. His pale gray eyes were waiting, entirely stripped of their defenses, offering me the key to the glass cage he had joked about building. I reached forward. My fingers brushed against his as I picked up the silver recorder. My starting salary, I said, my voice perfectly level, will be unreasonable. Sterling's smile returned, slow, devastating, and entirely genuine. I expect nothing less. I pressed the button on the side of the device. Click. The red light turned off. The recording stopped. And in the quiet of the 54th floor, above the Manhattan storm, something entirely new began.